In today's video we have a really interesting little block called City Streets. Hi, I'm Tom and I am the Colourblind Quilter and you are watching Behind the Blocks Series 1. In today's video we are making a block called City Streets, and as soon as I saw this block I absolutely knew that I wanted to include this in our sampler quilt. It's such a fun looking block, I just really liked it. In this series we are making a sampler quilt with 12 blocks and we are building our skills as quilters, working on blocks that consist of squares and rectangles. So far with the construction methods that we've learned lots of techniques that are going to help make this block so easy to construct because of everything that we've already practiced. Now as always, there is a free worksheet in the description below, and in that worksheet you will find all the cutting instructions and step-by-step instructions on how to make this block, as well as a colouring page and a table that shows you how to make this block in different sizes. There's also a second worksheet that has all the fabric requirements and cutting instructions for you to make the entire sampler quilt. And then for colouring, there is a pre-quilt colouring page that you can use to make the sampler quilt your own, trying out different fabric colours and combinations to see what you come up with. At the end of this video, I am going to talk a little bit about how you can chain piece and assembly line sew this block, so make sure you stick around for that. And there's also going to be some example quilts made using this block, and as I alluded to in the last video, there are some really surprising results that came out of this one. So to make this block, you are going to need, in fabric A, you'll need 4 2¼ inch by 4 inch strips and 4 2¼ inch by 5 3/4 inch strips. In fabric B, you'll need 1 2¼ inch by 9¼ inch strip. In fabric D, you'll need 4 2¼ inch by 4 inch strips and 1 2¼ inch by 9¼ inch strip. And in the background, you'll need 2 2 inch by 5 3/4 inch strips and 1 2 inch by 12½ inch strip. Starting with all your pieces laid out and arranged, we're going to take the 2¼ inch by 9¼ inch fabrics B and D strips. We are going to place them right sides together and we are going to join those with a careful 1/4 inch seam. Pin is required. And then at the pressing mat, we are going to press towards the darker fabric. So place the darker fabric on top. Now when I was pressing this, I had a little bit of difficulty getting my seam to be fully open, so you can see I'm just adjusting and making some adjustments here. And then I'm just giving a little gentle tug on that seam to check that it's fully open. Now on the cutting mat, line this up with the lines on your mat and we're going to trim just a tiny sliver off the end to make sure that it's nice and straight. And then once we have done that, we are going to cut 2 1/4 inch segments, and you will get 4 from this with just a tiny little sliver left over again. Line up lines on your ruler with the seam line, the top and bottom and left edges of the strip unit set, and cut. Now we are going to take a 2 1/4 inch by 4 inch strip in fabric D and we're going to place it on top of this, and we are going to join it with a careful 1/4 inch seam. You can pin these, just be sure that that seam underneath doesn't get pushed in the wrong direction when you are sewing. I am chain piecing them, so just butt them up against each other as you go. And then once you are done with that, get a pair of scissors and snip those apart. At the pressing board, we are pressing them towards the fabric D strip we just attached, so have that on top, set your seam, roll it back with your fingers, press gently with the iron and be careful not to stretch, and repeat for all of the 4 blocks. Next, we are going to take the 2 1/4 inch by 4 inch fabric A red strip and we are going to attach it to the second unit. Please make sure you do have this on the right side. That blue square should be on the left hand side. Attach these right sides together with a careful 1/4 inch seam, pin as required, but I am just adjusting as I sew and chain piecing as I go. And then at the pressing mat, we are going to press these towards the red fabric. So have that on top, set the seam, roll it back, gently finger press with your finger and then press with your iron, repeating for each of the 4 blocks. Next up, we have the fabric A 2 1/4 inch by 5 3/4 inch strip attaching to the top. So again, we want to make sure that that blue square is on the left hand side at the top left corner of the block. I do use a leader when I'm chain piecing, it just catches any tension issues with my sewing machine, so you'll see that at the start every time I sew. I am just adjusting these as I go, and I'm making sure that the seams underneath do not get pushed in the wrong direction by my stitch plate. And then at the ironing board we are placing the red fabric on top, finger pressing and then rolling back and pressing with our iron, being very careful not to stretch the fabric, and you will have 4 of these units. And now it is time to attach a 2" by 5 3/4" sashing strip to these blocks. So first set them out as you see, and then we are going to attach that sashing strip to the left blocks on this. So take them right sides together and attach with a careful 1/4" seam. Again, just chain piece everything through, it saves so much time. And then at the pressing mat, we are going to press towards the sashing strip. Now, making sure you have these in the right orientation, you want to take these and place them right sides together. Now make sure that they are definitely the right orientation. So the top row and the bottom row. As you can see here, I'm just making sure that you can tell which one goes where. Again, press towards that sashing strip. Be careful not to stretch or distort this, just use your fingers and then press with the iron, and repeat for the second unit. Now, take the left hand side of the block and we're going to attach a 2" by 12.5" sashing strip to the entire length of this. You may want to pin this, but I'm just adjusting as I go and attaching with a careful 1/4" seam here. And again, I am going to be pressing towards the sashing strip. Now we are going to make tick marks on this to help us line up our sashing across that white strip. So with a ruler, place this butted up against the seam between the red and white fabric and make a tiny little tick mark on the other side of the block, and then repeat for the second side. Be very careful to make sure that that tick mark is not bigger than a 1/4", otherwise it will show through your seam. Now take the bottom of the block, place it right sides together and look for those sewing lines matching up with the tick marks that you have just made. Once you're happy, pin that, and this is one of the occasions where I do pin because I do not want this to move. And then at the sewing machine, we are going to join these with a careful 1/4" seam, just removing the pins when you get to it so that you don't sew over them. Adjust as necessary. And then we are again pressing towards that sashing unit. So set the seam, roll it back and finger press as you can see me doing here. Then I am pressing it with the iron nice and flat. And then I'm just checking on the back that all the seams are in the right direction. And that is how you make the City Streets block. So that was how to make the City Street blocks, and I'm sure that you'll recognise similarities in some of the other blocks that we've worked on. Indeed, the start of this feels very much like a log cabin, but then there are similarities to the woven block and similarities to the bento box as well. So you can see how that we build on our skills as we work on these differing blocks. Now, if you were going to chain piece this, I would take width of fabric strips and sew them together to make the starting of this block, which is the grey and blue. I would join the strips together and then I would cut them into segments. Then I would cut width of fabric strips and the rest of the colours required, and I would take those segments, I would sew them onto the width of fabric strip, and then I would cut them up and press them. And then I would continue with that, attaching the segments to width of fabric strips until I got to the end of the block. Very similar to how you would chain piece a bento box, a log cabin, the woven block. The methods are very similar, just different sizes of fabric. Now, my favourite tip from this video is using the little tick marks across from the seam so that when you are lining your sashing up, those seams match perfectly. This is something that I really used to struggle with, and I would find that my seams were always just maybe a 1/4 inch out, and it would just look a bit wonky as you were sewing across. And that got worse and worse where you were placing more and more of these blocks together. But by placing those little tick marks, it helps you to line up those seams exactly across from it, and therefore you get a good straight sashing in between the blocks. Just be sure to make sure that those tick marks are smaller than a 1/4 inch because we do not want them to show through on the block after we have attached the other side of the block. You can use anything, pen, pencil, it doesn't really matter as long as they're small enough not to be seen. And that's a great tip for sashing any block, and I encourage you to try it out and use it on your other blocks and just see how useful that is. Now, I'm very excited to share some of these example quilts with you because they are really surprising how they turned out. And actually, when you put these together, you end up with other blocks and lots of secondary patterns. So let's take a look at these. So here we have the first example, and already you can see what happens just by placing these blocks together in rows and columns. It creates this amazing secondary pattern of a square and a square block. It may look like I have actually put sashing in between these, but I promise you I have not. These are just the blocks laid out as they are. I was so excited when I saw this. I was like, oh, the possibilities of things that you could do with this. You'll notice that I have added a white border around the outside to just make this float and to add to the effect. And when I was looking at this before I started recording, I actually thought how cool this would be if there was a way to make this so that as you get towards the center of the quilt, the squares get larger in size, and as you move to the edges of the quilt, they get smaller to create a kind of 3D visual effect. Not sure the quilty maths required to make that happen, but I bet that would look amazing. So with that in mind, let's move on to the other exciting examples. Now, this time, I have introduced white sashing in between the blocks, so now it's a little bit easier to see the city street block in there in between the sashing. But you can see how it started to create this network of grids with just plain white sashing in between each block and in between each row. Again, thin white border on the outside just helps the effect to float. But this is so cool, I really like this. And I think that is amazing by just adding some simple white sashing, how it has completely and utterly changed the look of this quilt. It's very cool. And again, the idea of changing the sizes for these so that they're larger in the middle and smaller on the outside, that would be so cool. So after that, I thought, well, I wonder what would happen if we changed the color of the sashing to one of the colors in the blocks. And lo and behold, this is what happened. So we went for the blue, which is in the starter of this block. And as you can see, it now creates this secondary pattern with the blue, and it creates this squares and lines effect running across it. I have changed the outside border to blue to match as well to again make this float, and it has the effect of making all these little secondary patterns, and it looks like there's little bites being taken out of the outside of the block, and I really like that. There are some white lines on here that just show you where the sashing sits because it is a little bit difficult on your eye to see sometimes on a computer screen. The white lines on the edges of the blue sashing would not normally be there, it's just to help you see this. But you can see how cool this is, and I can imagine the quilting that you could do through this to really give it movement. Now for the next example, same as the one before, but this time we've changed the blue to red to create a similar effect with the red, but this time you can see how things are joining up because of the red outside of the city street block. Changed the outside border to red again to make this float, and everything joins up and connects nicely, and it's very clever. It almost feels a bit like a maze actually when you look at this, but I really enjoy this layout. I think it's very nice as well. And again, it's amazing just by changing the colour of sashing, the effect that this has had on this quilt. And you can actually really start to visualise why this would be called city streets. And you can imagine the blocks in a city, and it really starts to visualise that with this layout. Now in this final example, we have changed the sashing and the outside border to grey, and you can see this has now created a completely different look, and that comes from the fact that the sashing is touching more of the blocks, whereas before it was just touching the blue, now it's touching the grey, and the grey does make up a bigger part of this block, and it creates a nice visual look to it that feels like it's completely different from the previous examples, whilst it's still exactly the same layout with just a change of the colour of the sashing. And I really like how versatile this is. By just doing this, I can see at least 2 if not 3 secondary patterns in here, and when I look at these blue squares and the way that they're separated by the grey, it makes me think of a game called Connect 4 in the UK, where you had to match lines and rows with these little coloured discs. But I do love how versatile this is, and just changing something so simple like the sashing colour can create a totally different looking effect of this quilt. I think if you were to do this as a rainbow quilt or scrappy with a bit of planning and thought, it could create a completely different visual look and lots of interest in that. As I mentioned, having seen these 5 examples, really now I'm desperately looking for an excuse to make one of these quilts because they are just so cool and I really like them. And so that was the City Street blocks, and I think this is probably up there in one of my favourite blocks in this series so far. And I loved the sample quilts, and I am trying to think of an excuse to make one of them, so watch this space. Don't forget, there are free worksheets in the description below that you can download, step-by-step instructions, fabric requirements, and everything you need to make this block and the entire sampler quilt. There's also a colouring page on Prequilt that you can play with fabrics and colours to make the sampler quilt your own. I really do hope that you're following along with us, and I would love you to share your progress on Instagram using the hashtag VTBSeason1. And don't forget to tag me, the Colourblind Quilter, so that I can follow along and see all the lovely blocks that you have been making. In the penultimate video of this series, we are going to be making the Pennsylvania block. And after that, we have made all of our 12 blocks, and then we just need to finish our sampler. So we're almost at the end of this series. It's so exciting. And in fact, I was so excited to finish this quilt that I actually sat down, designed, wrote, and I'm working on the fabric requirements for season 2 of Behind the Blocks. So if you found this video helpful, please do consider giving it a thumbs up, and why not subscribe and click the bell so you get notified when the rest of the videos in this series come out so that you don't miss them. We have 2 more videos left in this series to go, and then that is season 1 wrapping up. So I really hope to see all your beautiful quilts that you'll be making. So take care, and I'll see you next time.